The gunshot pierced the silence of the Wyoming frontier as Frank Youngblood's horse reared beneath him, just outside the small town of Hollow Creek. It was May 1878, and the setting sun painted the mountains in hues of gold and crimson that would have been beautiful to anyone whose mind wasn't focused on survival. Frank steadied his mount with practiced hands, his eyes scanning the rolling plains for the source of the shot. Frank had been riding alone for so long that the sound of his own voice had become unfamiliar to him. At 32, the lines etched around his eyes told stories of a life lived hard under merciless skies. 3 years had passed since he'd lost his family's ranch to drought and debt, and 2 since he'd buried his father in a lonely grave on what was once their land. Since then, he'd wandered, taking work where he could find it, driving cattle, hunting bounties, and occasionally acting as hired protection for stagecoaches making the perilous journey through territory still contested by native tribes and outlaws alike. Another shot rang out, followed by a woman's scream. Frank's hand moved instinctively to the Colt revolver at his hip as he urged his horse forward. The sounds came from a small ravine just ahead, where the trail dipped between 2 rocky outcroppings. "Help! Please, someone help!" The woman's voice was desperate, strained with terror. Frank dismounted swiftly, tethering his horse to a scrub oak. Moving with the silent precision that had kept him alive through numerous encounters with desperate men, he crept toward the edge of the ravine. Below, he saw a stagecoach tipped onto its side, one wheel spinning uselessly in the air. 2 men lay motionless on the ground, the driver and a passenger, both face down in the dirt. 3 bandits were circling a woman who stood with her back pressed against the overturned coach, clutching a small derringer that she held with shaking hands. Now, miss," one of the bandits drawled, his voice carrying in the still air. "Ain't no need for that pea-shooter. We just want whatever valuables you got, and maybe a little hospitality." The woman's golden brown hair had come loose from its pins, falling in waves around her dirt-streaked face. Her traveling dress, once a deep blue, was now torn and stained with dust. Despite her fear, she stood defiantly, her chin raised. "Come any closer and I'll shoot," she warned, though Frank could see her hands trembling. Frank assessed the situation quickly. 3 against 1 weren't odds he enjoyed, but he'd faced worse. He drew his Colt and took careful aim at the nearest bandit. "That's far enough," he called out, his voice echoing off the ravine walls. All eyes turned toward him. "Drop your weapons and back away from the lady." The leader of the bandits spat on the ground. "Mind your own business, mister. There's 3 of us and only 1 of you." "That just means you'll have to find 3 graves instead of 1, Frank replied evenly. "I won't ask again." What followed was a blur of motion and gunfire. The bandits drew and fired wildly, but Frank had positioned himself with the setting sun at his back, half blinding them. His first shot caught the leader in the shoulder, spinning him around. His second found the leg of another. The 3rd bandit managed to squeeze off a shot that whistled past Frank's ear before a return shot from the cowboy sent him scrambling for cover. "This ain't worth dying for," shouted one of the wounded men, and within moments they were mounting their horses and fleeing, trailing curses and blood as they disappeared into the growing darkness. Frank approached the woman cautiously, holstering his weapon. Up close, he could see that she was younger than he'd first thought, perhaps 25, with eyes the color of a summer sky, wide with a mixture of relief and lingering fear. "Are you hurt, madam?" he asked, removing his hat. She lowered the derringer, her shoulders sagging. "No, thank you. They killed Mr. Jenkins, the driver, and Mr. Thompson, who was traveling with me." Her voice broke slightly. "They were going to—" She couldn't finish the sentence. "My name's Frank Youngblood," he said, offering his canteen. "Drink some water. What's your name?" "Bethany," she replied, accepting the water with gratitude. "Bethany Summers. I was traveling to Fort Yuma to take a position as a schoolteacher." She glanced at the bodies on the ground. "I don't know what to do now." Frank surveyed the scene grimly. The stagecoach was beyond repair with its axle snapped, and night was falling fast in bandit country. "We need to move. It's not safe here. We can bury these men properly, but then we have to find shelter before dark." As Frank set about the grim task of laying the dead to rest, Bethany gathered what belongings she could salvage from the wreckage, a small trunk of clothing, a few books, and a framed photograph that she carefully wrapped in a shawl. Frank noticed her quiet dignity, even in shock, as she said a few words over the makeshift graves. "There's an old line shack about 3 miles from here," Frank said, as he helped her onto his horse. "We can spend the night there, and tomorrow I'll take you to Hollow Creek. From there, you can catch another stage to Fort Yuma." Bethany nodded mutely, too exhausted for words. Frank mounted behind her, acutely aware of her body pressed against his as they rode. It had been years since he'd been this close to a woman, and he found himself noticing the faint scent of lavender that clung to her hair, despite the dust and sweat of the day. The line shack was little more than a crude shelter, a single room with a stone fireplace, a rickety table, and a narrow cot. Frank built a fire while Bethany sat wrapped in his spare blanket, staring into the flames. "You're very kind to help me, Mr. Youngblood," she said finally, breaking the silence. Frank shook his head. "Just doing what any decent man would do." "There aren't as many decent men left as you might think," she replied softly, "especially out here." As the fire crackled between them, Bethany began to talk, perhaps to keep the horrors of the day at bay. She told him about growing up in Boston, about losing her parents to influenza, and about her decision to come west where teachers were needed. "I wanted adventure," she admitted with a rueful smile. "I'd read so many stories about the frontier. They never mentioned bandits or overturned stagecoaches." "The West isn't always kind to dreamers," Frank said, pouring her a cup of coffee from the pot he'd set over the fire. "But it has its moments of beauty." "Like sunsets over mountains?" she asked. "Like that, and like finding courage where you least expect it." He met her eyes. "Most people would have fallen apart after what you went through today. You didn't." Bethany's cheeks flushed slightly, and for the first time, Frank noticed the dimple that appeared when she smiled. Something stirred in his chest, an unfamiliar warmth he hadn't felt in years. "You should get some rest," he said abruptly, standing and moving toward the door. "Take the cot. I'll keep watch outside." Frank spent the night leaning against the wall of the shack, listening to the coyotes howl in the distance and trying not to think about the woman sleeping inside. He'd learned long ago that attachments were dangerous in a land where death could come from a bullet, a rattlesnake, or a harsh winter. He'd built walls around what remained of his heart, and he intended to keep them standing. Morning came with a gentle rain that washed the dust from the air. Bethany emerged from the shack looking remarkably composed despite her ordeal. She'd repinned her hair and mended a tear in her dress as best she could. "We should reach Hollow Creek by noon, if we start now," Frank said, saddling his horse. The ride to town was mostly silent, but not uncomfortably so. Frank found himself pointing out landmarks, a hawk's nest atop a dead pine, the tracks of a mountain lion in the soft earth, the distant silhouette of Hollow Creek appearing on the horizon. The town was typical of many frontier settlements, a main street lined with a general store, a saloon, a small hotel, and various other establishments catering to the needs of ranchers and travelers. Heads turned as Frank rode in with Bethany seated before him. It wasn't often that Hollow Creek saw a well-dressed Eastern woman, even one with travel-stained clothes. Frank helped Bethany down from the horse in front of the hotel. "The next stage to Fort Yuma leaves in 3 days," he informed her. "I'll speak to the sheriff about what happened, and you should be safe here until then." Bethany looked up at him, her blue eyes serious. "How can I ever repay you, Mr. Youngblood?" "No need," he replied gruffly. "Just be careful out there, Miss Summers." He tipped his hat and turned to leave, but her voice stopped him. "Will I see you again before I depart?" Frank hesitated. The sensible answer was no. He had no business in Hollow Creek, and certainly no reason to complicate his solitary existence with thoughts of a schoolteacher bound for Fort Yuma. And yet, "Perhaps," he said, not quite meeting her eyes, "I have some business to attend to in town." Over the next 3 days, Frank found numerous reasons to remain in Hollow Creek. He took a room at the boarding house across from the hotel, telling himself it was merely convenient. He visited the general store for supplies he didn't need, walked past the hotel more times than necessary, and finally, on the second evening, found himself knocking on Bethany's door with an invitation to dinner at the town's only restaurant. She accepted with a smile that made his heart skip a beat, something he would have considered impossible just days before. Dressed in a simple but elegant green dress she'd purchased from the general store, Bethany looked transformed from the frightened woman in the ravine. Her golden brown hair was arranged in soft curls, and the dimple in her cheek appeared more frequently as they conversed over a meal of venison stew and fresh bread. "Tell me about yourself, Mr. Youngblood," she said, studying him with genuine interest. "You know my story, but I know very little about you." Frank wasn't accustomed to talking about himself, but he found himself telling her about his childhood on his father's ranch, about the drought that had destroyed their livelihood, and about the years since, drifting from job to job. "Do you ever think about settling down again?" Bethany asked. Frank stared into his coffee. "Not much point in it. This country takes as much as it gives. Better not to have anything that can be taken away." "That sounds like a lonely way to live," she observed softly. "Maybe," he acknowledged, "but it's safer." "Safer isn't always better," Bethany said, reaching across the table to touch his hand briefly. The contact sent an unexpected jolt through him. Sometimes the things worth having are the ones that require risk. Later, as they walked back to the hotel under a sky blazing with stars, Frank found himself wondering what it might be like to risk his heart again. Bethany moved beside him, her arm occasionally brushing his, her voice animated as she spoke of her plans for teaching in Fort Yuma. "I hear it's terribly hot there," she said with a small laugh, "but they say the children are eager to learn, and that's all that matters to me." Frank nodded, trying to imagine this refined Eastern woman in the brutal heat of the Arizona territory. Fort Yuma was known as one of the harshest posts in the West, where summer temperatures regularly exceeded 120 degrees. It was also dangerously close to the border, with all the troubles that entailed. "It won't be easy," he warned. "Fort Yuma isn't Boston." "I'm stronger than I look," Bethany replied with quiet confidence. "Besides, after surviving a stagecoach robbery, I think I can handle a little heat." They reached the hotel, and Bethany turned to face him. In the soft light spilling from the windows, her face was luminous, her eyes reflecting the stars above. "Thank you for dinner, Mr. Youngblood," she said, "and for everything else." Frank felt an urge to reach for her, to pull her close and discover if her lips tasted as sweet as they looked. Instead, he removed his hat and bowed slightly. "My pleasure, Miss Summers. Good night." He walked away, cursing himself for a fool. Tomorrow she would board the stage for Fort Yuma, and he would ride out of Hollow Creek, and that would be the end of it. Just another brief encounter in a life full of transient connections. But that night, as he lay awake in his rented room, Frank couldn't stop thinking about Bethany's smile, about the dimple in her cheek, and about her words. Sometimes the things worth having are the ones that require risk. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to wonder if there might be something worth staying for, worth fighting for. Morning dawned clear and bright. Frank packed his few belongings and settled his bill at the boarding house. He led his horse toward the stagecoach office, telling himself he was merely being polite by seeing Bethany off. The stage was already waiting, the driver loading luggage onto the roof. Bethany stood on the boardwalk, dressed in a traveling outfit of pale blue. Her face lit up when she saw him, and Frank felt that unfamiliar warmth spread through his chest again. "I was hoping you'd come," she said, smiling up at him. "Couldn't let you leave without saying goodbye," he replied, suddenly awkward. I got you something." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small knife in a leather sheath. "It's not much, but a lady traveling alone should have protection. It's easier to use than that derringer if trouble comes close." Bethany accepted the gift, her fingers brushing his. "Thank you. I'll keep it with me always." The driver called for passengers to board. Bethany hesitated, looking up at Frank with something unspoken in her eyes. "Fort Yuma's a long way from here," Frank said, the words coming before he could stop them. "It's dangerous country." "Are you worried about me, Mr. Youngblood?" she asked, a hint of teasing in her voice. "Maybe I am," he admitted. "Maybe I'm thinking it's not right for a lady to travel alone in such places." "What are you suggesting?" Frank took a deep breath. "I'm not suggesting anything. I'm asking if you'd consider staying in Hollow Creek. They need a teacher here, too. The children are taught in the back of the church when the circuit preacher isn't using it. It's not much, but..." Bethany's eyes widened. "Are you asking me to stay because of the children's education, Mr. Youngblood?" Frank met her gaze directly. "No, Miss Summers. I'm asking you to stay because in 3 days, you've made me remember what it feels like to care about tomorrow, and I'd like to see where that might lead." The dimple appeared in her cheek as she smiled. That's quite a declaration from a man who believed he had nothing worth risking his heart for. "Maybe I was wrong," Frank said quietly. The driver called again, more insistently this time. Bethany glanced at the waiting stagecoach, then back at Frank. "I made a commitment to Fort Yuma," she said. "I gave my word." Frank nodded, trying to hide his disappointment. "I understand. A promise is a promise." "Yes, it is." Bethany reached up and touched his cheek gently. "Which is why I should tell you that my contract with Fort Yuma allows for substitutions if a suitable replacement can be found. There was another teacher interested in the position who might still be available." Hope flared in Frank's chest. "Are you saying—" "I'm saying that perhaps I should send a telegram before making any decisions," Bethany replied, her eyes sparkling. "Would you be willing to wait a few more days while I sort this out?" Frank's answer was immediate. "I'd wait as long as it takes." The telegram was sent, and the reply came 2 days later. The substitute teacher was indeed available and eager for the position. Bethany wrote a formal letter of withdrawal, citing unforeseen circumstances, and enclosed a month's salary from her own savings as compensation for any inconvenience. During those days of waiting, Frank and Bethany spent every moment together. He showed her the countryside around Hollow Creek, the stands of aspen that would turn golden in the fall, the clear streams teeming with trout. They picnicked beneath cottonwood trees and talked about everything and nothing, her dreams of building a proper school someday, his knowledge of the land and its seasons. On the evening after the telegram arrived confirming that her replacement had been accepted, Frank took Bethany to his favorite spot, a high bluff overlooking the valley where Hollow Creek nestled like a jewel in the vast wilderness. "It's beautiful," Bethany breathed, taking in the panoramic view as the sun began to set. "I never imagined Wyoming could be like this." "Neither did I, when I first arrived," Frank admitted. "I was too busy surviving to notice the beauty. But it was always there, waiting to be seen." Bethany turned to face him, her hair catching the golden light of the setting sun. "Like you were waiting to be seen?" Frank stepped closer, emboldened by the warmth in her eyes. "Bethany, I don't have much to offer. No ranch, no fortune. Just my hands and my heart." "That's more than enough," she whispered. When he finally kissed her, it was like coming home to a place he'd never been before. Her lips were soft beneath his, yielding yet eager, and Frank knew with absolute certainty that he'd found something worth any risk. The town council was delighted to hire Bethany as Hollow Creek's first permanent teacher. The old church basement was cleaned and furnished with crude desks made by the town carpenter. Books were ordered, and within weeks, Bethany had 15 students ranging from 6 to 16 years of age. Frank, meanwhile, took a job at the Thompson Ranch outside of town. His knowledge of cattle and horses made him valuable, and the steady work allowed him to start saving for a place of his own. Each evening, he would ride into town to escort Bethany home from school, often staying for supper at her small rented room behind the general store. Their courtship progressed with a blend of old-fashioned propriety and frontier practicality. Hollow Creek was too small for secrets, and the townspeople watched with approval as the lonely cowboy and the eastern schoolteacher fell deeper in love. 3 months after Bethany decided to stay, Frank proposed. It wasn't an elaborate affair, just the two of them walking by the creek that gave the town its name. Stopping beneath a willow tree where Frank suddenly dropped to one knee. "I never thought I'd find someone who made me want to build something permanent again," he said, holding out a simple gold band. "But you changed that, Bethany Summers, with your courage and your smile and your belief that some things are worth risking everything for." Tears glistened in Bethany's eyes as she accepted the ring. "And are you still afraid of losing what you build?" she asked softly. Frank shook his head. "Not anymore. The fear of never having it at all is much greater." They were married in October, when the aspens had turned to gold and the air was crisp with the promise of winter. The whole town turned out for the celebration, held in the newly constructed schoolhouse that had been Bethany's wedding gift from the community. Sheriff Miller gave away the bride, and Mrs. Thompson from the ranch played the piano as Bethany walked down the aisle in a dress of ivory satin ordered specially from Denver. Frank, standing at the front in a new suit that still felt stiff around the shoulders, thought his heart might burst when he saw her. The girl he'd rescued from bandits now walked toward him, with confident steps, and a smile that outshone the autumn sun streaming through the windows. "You look beautiful," he whispered when she reached him. "And you look terrified," she whispered back, with a mischievous glint in her eye. "Having second thoughts, Mr. Youngblood?" "Not a single one, soon to be Mrs. Youngblood," he replied, taking her hand. They established their home in a small cabin on the edge of town, close enough for Bethany to walk to the schoolhouse each day, but with enough land for Frank to start building their dream. With his savings and Bethany's teacher's salary, they purchased 20 acres where Frank began breeding horses, specializing in the sturdy, intelligent mounts needed for the demanding work of the frontier. Life wasn't always easy. Their first winter together brought blizzards that isolated Hollow Creek for weeks at a time. Spring brought flooding that nearly washed away the bridge to town. Summer brought drought that tested Frank's ability to keep their small herd healthy. But through it all, they faced each challenge together. Frank marveled at Bethany's resilience, the Boston girl who had adapted to frontier life with grace and determination, who could now ride as well as most men in the county, who taught children by day and helped birth foals by night. And Bethany watched with pride as Frank, the man who had once believed he had nothing worth risking his heart for, opened himself to joy again. He became a respected member of the community, serving on the town council, helping newcomers establish themselves, and always ready to ride out when neighbors were in trouble. 2 years after their wedding, Bethany gave birth to their first child, a son they named Daniel after Frank's father. Standing beside the bed where Bethany cradled their newborn, Frank felt a completeness he had never thought possible. "He has your eyes," Bethany said, smiling up at him. "And your stubborn chin," Frank replied, gently touching the baby's face. "Poor kid." Bethany laughed, the sound Frank had come to treasure above all others. "Are you happy, Frank Youngblood?" Frank sat beside her on the bed, gathering his family into his arms. "Happier than I ever thought possible," he admitted, "and terrified all at once." "That's what love is," Bethany said softly. "The most wonderful terror in the world." As their son grew, so did their dreams. Frank's horse breeding business prospered, allowing them to add a proper farmhouse to their land. Bethany continued teaching until their second child, a daughter named Grace, arrived 3 years later. After that, she focused on creating a school in their home, teaching their children and those of neighboring ranchers too distant from town to attend regular classes. Life in the Wyoming Territory remained challenging. There were difficult years when drought withered the grass and sickness swept through the town. There were moments of fear when rumors of unrest or outlaw gangs reached Hollow Creek, but through it all, Frank and Bethany's love only deepened, tempered by shared struggles and joys. On their 10th anniversary, Frank took Bethany back to the bluff where he had first kissed her. The valley below had changed. Hollow Creek had grown into a proper town, with a train station and more substantial buildings. Their own land, visible in the distance, now boasted a large white farmhouse, stables, and fenced pastures where horses grazed. "Remember what you told me when we first met?" Frank asked, his arm around her waist. "About the things worth having being the ones that require risk?" Bethany nodded, leaning against him. "I remember." "You were right," he said simply. "Every risk, every moment of fear, every struggle, they were all worth it for this." He gestured to the life they had built together. Bethany turned in his arms, the years having added character to her beauty. The dimple in her cheek still appeared when she smiled, and it still made Frank's heart skip a beat. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if those bandits hadn't attacked my stagecoach?" she asked. "If our paths had never crossed?" Frank shook his head. "I don't believe that would have been possible. Some things are meant to be, no matter what stands in their way." "Like a cowboy who thought he'd lost his heart finding it in a smile?" Bethany teased gently. "Exactly like that," Frank agreed, pulling her close. "And he keeps finding it there every single day." As the sun set over the Wyoming frontier, painting the world in the same hues of gold and crimson that had colored the sky the day they met, Frank and Bethany Youngblood stood together on the bluff, surrounded by the life they had built from courage and love and the willingness to risk everything for something beautiful. And in the warmth of Bethany's smile, Frank found again what he had discovered that day in the ravine, that sometimes, the greatest treasures come disguised as moments of peril, and that a heart once thought lost can find its way home in the most unexpected places.